Yes.
How much do you think people like Abel Meeropol and Billie Holiday helped prepare for the civil rights movement? Do you think they contributed more than the NAACP, for example?
The people that you mentioned were important people insofar as, the song Strange Fruit was an important song memorializing lynching. And that was important, but was it as important as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP? No. There's no organization in American history, certainly in the 20th century, any of that was more important than the NAACP. So, for instance, you mentioned Brown versus Board of Education. The lawyers that brought that case were lawyers that worked for the NAACP. The NAACP was begun in 1909. It still exists. It's still an important organization, but there's been no organization in American history more important in advancing racial justice than the NAACP. I had the good fortune of working for the most famous lawyer who worked for the NAACP, the great Thurgood Marshall. And there are other people who work for the NAACP. You mentioned, to get back to your question, you mentioned, was I aware of, when I was growing up, of racial injustice? I have a very clear memory. In 1963, in fact, on June 11th, the evening of June 11th, 1963, there was a very great man in Jackson, Mississippi. His name was Medgar Evers. That night, the evening of June 11, 1963, Medgar Evers was killed. He was shot to death in front of his home. He was the executive director of the NAACP in Mississippi. He was a young man. He was in his 30s when he was killed, and he had been a veteran. He had fought in World War II for the United States of America, and he was buried in a cemetery in the United States. It's called Arlington National Cemetery. If you're a veteran, you have a right to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and that's where he was buried. And his body was transported from Jackson, Mississippi to Washington, D.C. And my parents went to pay their respects. He was at a funeral home in downtown Washington, D.C. And I went with my parents, and the whole way to the funeral home, my parents argued as to whether I should be allowed in the funeral home to actually see Medgar Evers' body. My father wanted me to go into the funeral home. My mother did not. My mother won the argument. So I stayed in the car while they went and paid their respects. But I remember that very clearly, very clearly. There were people throughout the 1960s who suffered a great deal because of their civil rights activism, and I was very aware of that.